The truth always waits for the brightest spotlight. The crystal chandeliers above the Manhattan Charity Gala cast rivers of gold across the marble floor as every camera in the room turned toward the stage, where Ethan Whitmore stood in a midnight tuxedo worth more than most people's monthly rent, the polished face of Whitmore Global and the man every business magazine in America called untouchable. Tonight was supposed to be about legacy, family values, and the new children's hospital wing his company had funded, but the second he reached for Claire Kensington's hand instead of his wife's, the temperature in the ballroom seemed to drop. Claire, radiant in white silk, stepped into the center of the light with the practiced smile of a woman who had spent years learning exactly how to belong in rooms built for power. Then Ethan did the one thing no one expected. In front of donors, board members, politicians, and a wall of flashing cameras, he lifted Claire's hand to his lips and said into the microphone, "This is the woman who truly understands my future." A ripple of gasps moved through the room like wind across glass. At the far edge of the stage, almost hidden where the light softened into shadow, Amara Whitmore stood perfectly still. His wife. His black wife. The woman whose name still sat beside his on every legal document that mattered. She didn't flinch. She didn't give the room the breakdown they were silently begging to witness. Instead, her fingers tightened around the small cream envelope inside her clutch, the edges worn from how many times she had almost handed it to him over the last 72 hours. Inside was the first truth. A lab report. A quiet answer to a question Ethan had stopped asking months ago. Beneath the fitted emerald gown, her breathing stayed measured, her shoulders straight, her dignity untouched by the whispers already rising around the ballroom. Some guests looked at her with pity, others with curiosity, but Amara kept her gaze fixed on Ethan, watching the man she had once built a life with smile for cameras that never cared who got broken beneath their flashes. Claire leaned closer to him, feeding the illusion, blonde hair, catching the chandelier light like something sculpted for this exact betrayal. The social feeds were already exploding. Phones tilted. Screens glowed. Somewhere near the front row, one of the junior board members muttered, "Isn't he still married?" And the question floated through the room like smoke. Ethan heard it. Amara knew he did. But instead of stepping back, he placed his hand at Claire's waist and turned toward the photographers as if this moment had been rehearsed, polished, approved. The cruelty of it wasn't loud. It was elegant, public, intentional, and that was what made it unforgettable. Amara slowly exhaled, the kind of breath that felt like closing a door forever. In that instant, something inside her shifted, not heartbreak, because heartbreak required surprise, and Ethan had been leaving her in pieces for over a year now. No, this was clarity. Cold, sharp, liberating clarity. She thought of the second envelope waiting in her apartment safe uptown, the one she had ordered that same morning after seeing the photo of Ethan and Claire leaked from a Hamptons fundraiser. DNA pre-screening. Private, discreet, undeniable. She had not wanted war. She had wanted honesty. But under the white blaze of Manhattan chandeliers, with her husband choosing image over truth in front of half the city, Amara understood something that changed the shape of the night. Men like Ethan only heard truth when it arrived dressed as consequence. Without a single word, she turned away from the stage. Her heels moved across the marble in slow, deliberate clicks, each step pulling her farther from the spectacle and closer to something stronger than revenge. Around her, the gala noise swelled again. Forced laughter, hushed gossip, the rustle of designer gowns, but none of it touched her now. In the mirrored hallway outside the ballroom, she stopped just long enough to look at her own reflection. Calm eyes, chin high, a woman still fully in possession of herself. She placed one hand over her stomach, just for a second, and whispered the promise that would define everything that came next. "He'll know the truth," she said softly, her voice steady as steel, but only when the world is watching. Then she walked into the New York night, carrying silence, dignity, and the first piece of proof that would one day bring Ethan Whitmore to his knees. The penthouse was silent in a way that made every sound feel louder. The soft click of Amara's heels across the walnut floor, the distant hum of traffic 30 stories below, even the quiet chime of her phone lighting up again and again with messages from people pretending concern while chasing gossip. She did not check a single one. Instead, She crossed the living room wrapped in floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the East River and set her clutch on the marble island with the same controlled precision she had carried out of the gala. The cream envelope slipped into her hand once more, its edges now warm from the heat of her palm. For a long moment, she only stared at it, the city lights reflecting against the silver lettering of the medical lab logo. 3 days ago, she had almost given it to Ethan over breakfast. He had been distracted, scrolling through market reports, his coffee cooling untouched, while she sat across from him carrying a truth that could have changed the entire shape of their marriage. She remembered the exact way the morning light hit the kitchen glass, the exact pause in her breathing when she almost said the words. Then his phone lit up with Claire's name. He smiled before he even answered. That was the moment Amara had folded the envelope shut again. Tonight had simply confirmed what her instincts had already known. The man she married had become a curator of appearances, a collector of polished moments. And somewhere inside that obsession, he had stopped seeing the woman who had once stood beside him when Whitmore Global was still just a risky logistics startup in a borrowed office downtown. She moved toward the built-in safe hidden behind a framed black-and-white photograph from their first year together. In the picture, Ethan's tie was crooked, her curls were windblown, and both of them looked exhausted and happy in the kind of way success can never recreate. The memory tightened in her chest, but it did not weaken her. She keyed in the code, opened the steel door, and slid. The cream envelope beside the second folder already waiting there. The private DNA pre-screening request. Her attorney had arranged it that afternoon through one of the most discreet labs in Manhattan, the kind executives used when truth needed to be undeniable. She stared at the two envelopes side by side, one carrying the beginning of life, the other preparing to protect it. The symmetry felt almost cruel. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach again, gentle, protective, certain. I will not let him rewrite this story, she whispered into the stillness. Outside, rain had begun tapping against the glass, soft and rhythmic, turning the skyline into a blur of silver and red. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was not gossip. It was Ethan. His name glowed across the screen like a delayed consequence. Amara let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Then she answered, not because she needed closure, but because silence was most powerful when chosen, not forced. Why did you leave like that? Ethan's voice came through low, controlled, but frayed at the edges in a way she had not heard in years. Behind him, she could make out the muted sounds of the gala after-party, laughter too bright, music too polished, the artificial world he had chosen still spinning around him. Amara walked toward the window, looking out over the rain-slick streets below. You made your choice in front of the city, she said evenly. I simply made mine in private. He exhaled sharply. Claire is complicated. For the first time that night, a faint smile touched her lips, not warm, not bitter, just knowing. No, Ethan. The cameras were complicated. Your image is complicated. Claire was just convenient. The silence on the other end stretched longer this time. She could almost feel him recalculating, trying to fit her calm into the narrative he preferred. But Amara was already outside of his control now. We need to talk tomorrow, he finally said. About us. Her gaze lowered to the blurred reflections of taillights moving like blood-red ribbons across the avenue below. Tomorrow is too late for us, she replied softly. Tomorrow is when I start thinking about what comes next. Before he could answer, she ended the call. The quiet that followed felt different from the silence in the penthouse when she first walked in. This one carried direction. Purpose. She turned from the window, crossed back to the safe, and rested her fingertips against the DNA request folder one final time before closing the steel door. Somewhere across the city, Ethan Whitmore was still standing beneath chandeliers and camera flashes, convinced tonight had been a victory of optics. But Amara now held something stronger than optics. She held time, truth, and the patience to let both mature into proof. And far downtown, in the mirrored lobby of Whitmore Global, the giant digital billboard still looping gala footage caught a final image before midnight. Ethan smiling beside Claire while his wife walked away without once looking back. It would be the last moment he ever mistook her silence for weakness. For years changed everything except the truth. Morning light spilled across the hardwood floors of Amara's brownstone in Brooklyn, warm and soft against the quiet order of the life She had rebuilt from the ashes of a public betrayal. The house was not a penthouse of mirrored glass and skyline vanity. It was something steadier. Red brick, tall windows, shelves lined with legal journals, framed civil rights awards, and photographs that held joy instead of performance. At the breakfast table, a little boy in a Navy school sweater swung his legs exactly 2 inches above the floor, focused intensely on aligning blueberries into perfect rows beside his pancakes. Noah Whitmore was 4 years old, and every day he became harder to explain away from the man whose face still appeared on magazine covers in every airport newsstand across America. The same gray eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same tiny crease between his brows when he concentrated too hard. Amara stood by the stove, watching him with a smile that belonged entirely to this life, and none of the one she left behind. "Mom," Noah said, looking up with syrup on the edge of his lip, "are ties only for grown-up meetings?" His question made her pause because even his voice was beginning to carry the calm authority Ethan had once. Weaponized in boardrooms. She crossed the kitchen, knelt beside him, and wiped the syrup away with a napkin. "Mostly," she said softly, smoothing the collar of his sweater. "But today, your blazer is enough." Today mattered. Atlas Legal Advocacy, the nonprofit law center Amara had built into one of New York's most respected civil justice institutions, had just been invited to present at the National Corporate Ethics Summit in Manhattan. The irony was almost too perfect. The keynote sponsor was Whitmore Global, Ethan's company. For years, she had avoided rooms that carried his name, not from fear, but from discipline. She believed timing was part of dignity. Truth delivered too early became noise. Truth delivered at the right moment became legacy. Her gaze drifted to the leather folder resting on the kitchen counter beside her car keys. Inside were the finalized DNA results, triple certified, sealed, and impossible to challenge. She had waited until Noah was old enough to walk beside her with confidence, old enough for the world to see not just a resemblance, but a living reflection. Noah reached for his orange juice, then tilted his head with that same thoughtful expression Ethan used before making billion-dollar acquisitions. "Will there be cameras?" he asked. Amara's hand still lightly rested against the back of his chair. "Probably," she answered honestly. "A lot of cameras." He considered that with surprising seriousness, then nodded. "Then I will smile nice." The innocence of it nearly broke her, not with sadness, but with the weight of how carefully she had protected this child from becoming collateral damage in a story built by adult vanity. She kissed the top of his curls and stood, moving toward the counter where her phone screen lit with the morning's news alert. Ethan Whitmore to headline Corporate Ethics Summit with keynote on leadership and family values. The headline sat there glowing in sharp black letters against a white screen, so detached from reality it almost felt like satire. Family values. The phrase lingered in her mind as she zipped the leather DNA folder closed. Across the city, Ethan was preparing to step behind a podium and speak about trust, image, and responsibility. He had no idea that before the day ended, the truest reflection of his legacy would walk into that same room, holding Amara's hand. The car ride into Manhattan was wrapped in late autumn sunlight, gold leaves skimming across the sidewalks as traffic crawled down the FDR Drive. Noah sat in the back seat humming softly, his polished shoes tapping against the booster seat in a rhythm that matched the quiet certainty building inside her chest. Not revenge. Never revenge. This was about restoration. About letting truth enter the same polished spaces where lies had once been applauded. When the black sedan finally pulled beneath the sweeping glass canopy of the Midtown Convention Center, cameras were already clustered outside the entrance, catching arrivals from Fortune 500 companies, senators, and media executives. Noah looked out the window, eyes wide but fearless. "That is a lot of people," he whispered. Amara took his small hand in hers, steady and warm. "Just stay beside me." Together they stepped onto the sidewalk, the flash of cameras bouncing off the mirrored walls of the building. Across the giant digital screen in the lobby, Ethan's face appeared above the words leadership, legacy, trust. Noah stopped walking. His eyes lifted to the screen, then back to Amara. For a second the world around them seemed to quiet. "Mom," he asked, voice small but clear, "why does that man on the screen look like me?" Amara's heartbeat slowed into something sharp and absolute. The moment had arrived exactly as she planned it. She squeezed his hand gently, her gaze fixed on the towering image of Ethan inside the lobby. "Because today," she said, calm as marble, "the truth finally gets its turn in the spotlight." The lobby doors parted into a flood of white light and polished marble, swallowing Amara and Noah into the kind of corporate spectacle Ethan had spent his life mastering. The Midtown Convention Center rose around them in mirrored walls and towering glass, every surface reflecting power, wealth, and the carefully engineered illusion of integrity. Reporters lined the velvet ropes near the escalators, their voices blending into a constant low hum, while giant LED banners looped the summit slogan across the atrium in silver letters: leadership, legacy, trust. Noah's small hand stayed wrapped in hers, warm and steady, though his eyes kept lifting toward the massive digital screens where Ethan's face rotated above a live countdown to the keynote. The resemblance was no longer subtle beneath the unforgiving brightness of public space. The same gray eyes stared from the screen and from the child beside her. A few heads turned, then more. Recognition moved through the lobby in whispers before it ever reached words. Amara felt it happen the same way storms build over the Atlantic. First pressure, then inevitability. She kept walking, posture straight, emerald coat falling in clean lines to her knees, the leather DNA folder tucked beneath her arm, like the final chapter of a story she had refused to rush. Upstairs, the grand ballroom doors stood open, revealing rows of polished chairs, camera cranes, corporate banners, and a stage dressed in blue and white light. Ethan stood at the podium already, his voice smooth and measured through the speakers. "Trust," he was saying, "is the foundation of every enduring legacy." The sentence nearly stopped time. Amara did not smile. She simply tightened her hold on Noah's hand and stepped into the back of the ballroom. The audience was a constellation of power: senators, investors, nonprofit directors, journalists, and board members from every major corporation in the country. Every eye remained fixed on Ethan for exactly 3 more seconds. Then the first row of cameras near the press aisle shifted. One lens tilted toward the back. Another followed. A ripple moved across the room as faces turned in sequence, shoulder by shoulder, row by row, until the entire ballroom seemed to inhale at once. Ethan noticed it in the way only seasoned executives do, not by looking up immediately, but by sensing attention leave him. His fingers paused against the podium. His next sentence died unfinished. Slowly, he lifted his gaze toward the back of the room. For the first time in 4 years, Ethan Whitmore forgot how to perform. Amara stood framed in the ballroom doors like the embodiment of every truth he had once pushed into shadow. Beside her, Noah looked up at the stage with quiet curiosity, his tiny navy blazer perfect, his curls neatly shaped, his face carrying Ethan's features with a precision that no camera angle could soften. The silence that followed was not confusion. It was recognition. Claire Kensington, seated near the sponsor table in a cream designer suit, turned in her chair just as the first flashbulb exploded from the press row. Her expression tightened so quickly it almost escaped notice, but Amara caught it. Not guilt, not shame, fear. Ethan's grip on the podium whitened. The giant screen behind him still displayed the summit branding, his company logo gleaming beside the word trust, a visual irony too sharp for anyone in the room to miss now. Noah leaned slightly toward Amara and whispered, clear enough in the microphone-heavy silence for the nearest cameras to capture, "Mom, is that the man from the screen?" A few people in the front rows visibly stiffened. A journalist near the aisle lowered her tablet and stared openly. Amara stepped forward, heels clicking across the marble center aisle with the same calm rhythm she had once carried out of his gala. No hurry, no anger, only timing. Every step pulled the room tighter. Ethan finally spoke, but the practiced confidence was gone from his voice. Amara, just her name, nothing more. No title, no defense, no explanation. The room heard the fracture in it. She reached the foot of the stage and stopped beneath the white spill of overhead lights, the leather folder still sealed in her arm. Noah stood beside her, one hand resting lightly against her coat, as if instinctively knowing she was the safest place in the room. Ethan stared down at the child, and whatever polished script had brought him to this summit dissolved completely. The resemblance was now merciless in person. The shape of Noah's mouth, the angle of his brows, Even the way he stood with quiet seriousness mirrored Ethan's own childhood photos that once decorated the executive wing of Whitmore Global. Claire rose abruptly from her table, but the room was no longer looking at her. For the first time in years, every lens, every whisper, every measure of public judgment belonged entirely to Amara. She lifted her chin, gaze steady on Ethan beneath the summit lights that had once glorified his image. Then, in a voice calm enough to cut through marble, cameras, and the collective breath of the room, she said, "You built your legacy in public, Ethan. I came here so the truth could do the same." The ballroom remained suspended in a silence so complete that even the faint hum of the camera rigs above the press aisle seemed louder than breath. Ethan stood frozen behind the podium, the polished confidence that had carried him through hostile acquisitions, Senate hearings, and media storms now stripped down to something startlingly human. His eyes never left Noah. The child stood beside Amara with a quiet steadiness that made the resemblance impossible to deny, one small hand resting against the side of her coat, gray eyes lifted toward the man on stage as if searching for an answer the room already knew. Amara moved first. She ascended the short set of marble steps to the stage with calm, measured grace, the leather folder held close against her side. Every heel click echoed through the summit ballroom like a countdown. Investors leaned forward in their seats. Reporters lifted phones higher. Board members from Whitmore Global exchanged glances sharp with panic. On the sponsor table, Claire Kensington remained standing, fingers tightening around the stem of her water glass, her carefully composed expression beginning to fracture under the weight of the moment she could no longer control. When Amara reached the podium, she did not take Ethan's place. She stood beside it, never stealing the stage, only sharing it with the truth. That distinction mattered. Her dignity was never about spectacle. It was about precision. Ethan finally found his voice, though it came quieter than anyone in the room had ever heard it. "What is this?" The question sounded almost absurd beneath the giant LED backdrop still glowing with the word trust. Amara turned toward him fully, her face calm, unreadable, beautiful in the cold summit lights. "This," she said softly, lifting the folder into view, "is what happens when truth waits long enough to be undeniable." A visible ripple moved through the audience as she opened the leather clasp. The sound was small, almost delicate, but in the charged stillness it landed like thunder. She withdrew the sealed laboratory packet, white with silver certification stamps from one of the most respected genetic institutes in the country. Triple verified, court admissible, immutable. The front row cameras zoomed in instantly. Noah looked up at the envelope, then back at Ethan, curiosity replacing uncertainty. Ethan's throat moved, but he said nothing. The answer was already written across his face. Amara stepped to the clear acrylic podium table and laid the packet flat against the glass surface beneath the summit lights. Every camera in the room caught the name printed across the top line, Noah Whitmore. Paternity confirmation. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the room erupted into whispers so fierce they became their own weather. Claire's face drained of color. One of the senior board members, a silver-haired woman who had once toasted Ethan as the future of corporate leadership, slowly removed her glasses and stared at the document in disbelief. Ethan looked down at the name again, then at Noah, and something inside him visibly gave way. The years between the gala betrayal and this stage collapsed in a single breath. "Why now?" he asked, the question rough, stripped of all executive polish. Amara's eyes did not harden. If anything, they softened with the calm authority of a woman who had already survived the worst part of the story. "Because before today, this would have been gossip," she answered. "Now it is legacy." The sentence settled over the room with the weight of final judgment. Noah shifted slightly closer to her, then looked up at Ethan with the direct innocence only children possess. "Are you the man from the picture in Mom's office?" he asked, his small voice carrying through the open stage microphones. A collective breath caught across the ballroom. Ethan stepped back from the podium as if the distance might somehow help him process what his eyes had already known the second he saw the boy. His gaze moved over Noah's features with something deeper than shock now. Recognition, grief, wonder. The pieces of his own face reflected in a child he had never held, never protected, never even known existed. Behind him, the giant screen still displayed his keynote title, ethics in leadership. The irony had become merciless. Claire suddenly took a step toward the aisle, clearly calculating escape, but a ring of cameras shifted in her direction before returning to Amara. She was no longer the story. Amara was. Noah was. The truth was. Amara placed one hand lightly on Noah's shoulder and faced the audience, not as Ethan's abandoned wife, but as the woman who had rebuilt herself so completely that even this moment belonged to her terms. Her voice remained even, strong enough for every microphone in the ballroom to carry it to the live stream outside. "I did not come here to destroy a man," she said. "I came here so my son would never grow up in the shadow of someone else's lie." Ethan's gaze lifted slowly to meet hers. All performance gone now. And for the first time since the summit began, the most powerful man in the room looked exactly what he was beneath the lights. A father standing face to face with the proof of everything he had failed to see. The summit did not end when the DNA file touched the podium. It fractured. The ballroom that had entered the morning as a temple of polished corporate virtue was now alive with the sharp electricity of truth spreading faster than any prepared keynote ever could. Reporters surged toward the press aisle, fingers flying across phones and tablets as alerts hit financial news feeds, political blogs, and every social platform that had spent years amplifying Ethan Whitmore's carefully managed image. Above the stage, the live stream comments rolled across the side monitors in a relentless ribbon of disbelief. The cameras that had once adored his leadership were now obsessed with the child standing beside Amara, a living contradiction to every curated narrative Whitmore Global had sold about family values and trust. Ethan remained still, staring at Noah with the kind of stunned focus that made the entire room feel secondary. But Claire moved. She stepped away from the sponsor table with urgency wrapped in designer poise, her cream heels sharp against the marble as she approached the edge of the stage. "This is inappropriate," she said, voice crisp, attempting authority. "A child should not be used in a media ambush." The sentence might have worked in another room, another year, another story. But today the optics belonged to truth, not spin. Amara turned slowly toward her, not angry, not reactive, simply certain. "No," she replied, her voice calm enough to cut through the rising noise. "What was inappropriate was watching you stand under chandeliers for years ago while my marriage was turned into public theater." A visible tremor passed through Claire's expression. It lasted less than a second, but the cameras caught it. More importantly, Ethan caught it. His gaze shifted from Noah to Claire, and for the first time the pieces began moving into place behind his eyes. The gala, the timing, the conveniently leaked photographs from the Hamptons fundraiser, the anonymous board rumors that Amara had become emotionally unstable during their separation, the pressure campaign that had quietly pushed him further into public appearances with Claire while isolating him from any private conversation that might have repaired what still remained. His voice dropped into something dangerously quiet, though still fully controlled. "What did you know?" Claire blinked. "Ethan, this is not the time." But the question had already changed the air. Senior board members began murmuring among themselves, and one of Whitmore Global's communications executives hurried toward the side of the stage with a tablet in hand, face pale. Ethan took it, his eyes scanning the screen. A series of internal emails had just been leaked to the summit press list. Time-stamped messages between Claire and two former public relations consultants. Subject lines referencing optics strategy, family image pivot, and demographic alignment for donor confidence. One line, in particular, seemed to hollow the room around him. "The black wife narrative does not test well for the legacy campaign. Reposition Claire as aspirational and future-facing." Ethan looked up slowly, his face drained not with embarrassment, but with the brutal clarity of a man realizing how thoroughly his blindness had been weaponized. Around the ballroom, whispers sharpened into outrage. Not scandal. Outrage. The cruelty was no longer merely personal. It was structural, strategic, racial, and designed to erase Amara from the version of his life the public was allowed to see. Claire lifted her chin, trying to recover control. "Those were recommendations from branding consultants," she said, each word now too polished to sound innocent. "Your company needed stability." Amara did not move. Her hand remained steady on Noah's shoulder, anchoring him in the middle of a room, finally confronting the ugliness beneath its gloss. "No," she said softly, her eyes never leaving Claire. His company needed truth. You sold him comfort because you knew it looked better under white light. The line landed like a verdict. Several cameras pivoted fully toward Claire now, catching the tightness in her jaw, the first cracks in the immaculate image she had spent years cultivating. Ethan stepped away from the podium and toward the front of the stage, his eyes fixed not on the media, not on the board, but on the woman who had stood beside him while he let the world rewrite his family. "Did you know about Noah?" he asked. Claire's silence answered before her lips ever parted. The room felt it. Ethan felt it. Amara felt the final piece settle into place. Claire finally spoke, quieter now, stripped of her socialite shine. "I knew there was a possibility," she admitted. But by then the narrative was already working. The collective gasp from the audience was immediate. Narrative. Not marriage. Not love. Narrative. Ethan closed his eyes for one brief second, the weight of 4 lost years settling over him like something physical. When he opened them again, he did not look at Claire. He looked at Noah, who stood calm and curious beneath the cameras, too young to understand the full machinery of what had been stolen from him. Then Ethan turned to Amara, his voice raw with the first honest humility the room had ever heard from him. "I let them build a future that erased you." Amara held his gaze without triumph. "No," she said, dignified and steady beneath the summit lights. "You let them build a future that erased your son." The room no longer belonged to Ethan Whitmore. Not the summit stage, not the cameras, not even the towering LED screens still glowing with words that now felt almost accusatory. Everything had shifted toward the small boy standing beside Amara, toward the woman who had carried truth long enough for it to mature into justice. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan understood what it meant to stand in a room where money could not fix timing, status could not soften consequence, and image could not outrun reality. He stepped down from the stage slowly, each movement stripped of the confidence that once defined him, until he stood only a few feet from Noah. The child looked up with wide gray eyes, curious rather than afraid, as if he sensed this moment mattered without understanding why. Ethan's throat tightened at the sight of himself reflected so perfectly in a life he had never touched. "Hi," he said quietly, the single word almost foreign coming from a man known for keynote speeches and billion-dollar declarations. Noah tilted his head. "Mom says you are important." The innocence of it landed harder than any boardroom scandal ever could. Ethan glanced at Amara, but she gave him nothing except calm permission to be honest for once. He lowered himself to one knee so he would meet Noah at eye level, his expensive suit brushing the stage floor he had once owned with certainty. "Your mom is right," he said carefully, voice rough with emotion he no longer bothered to hide. "But I should have been here a long time ago." Noah studied him with the solemn seriousness only children can summon. "Are you my dad?" The ballroom seemed to stop breathing again. Cameras zoomed in. Board members froze. Even the live stream comment ribbon slowed, as if the entire internet understood this was no longer about scandal, but something far more intimate and irreversible. Ethan did not look at the press. He did not check Claire, the board, or the communications team now scrambling behind the curtains. He only looked at the little boy whose existence had just exposed the emptiest part of his own success. "Yes," he answered, his voice steady despite the emotion pressing against every word. "I am your father." Noah blinked once, processing it in the simple, direct way children do. Then why did it take so long? The question moved through the ballroom like a current. No accusation, no bitterness, just truth in its purest form. Ethan inhaled slowly, then exhaled the kind of honesty he had denied himself for years. "Because I was listening to the wrong people," he said, eyes lifting briefly toward Amara before returning to Noah. "And because I forgot how to see what really mattered." Noah seemed to accept that in the quiet way children sometimes accept things adults spend years fighting. He nodded once, then reached into the pocket of his tiny blazer and pulled out a folded drawing page. Crayons. A brownstone house, a woman with curls, a little boy in blue, and an empty figure space beside them left in white. He held it up toward Ethan. "Mom said maybe one day I would know who goes here." Ethan stared at the blank outline in the family drawing, and something inside him cracked open with painful clarity. It was not dramatic. It was devastatingly gentle. 4 years of birthdays, school mornings, scraped knees, bedtime stories, first words, first fears, and first victories had all unfolded without him, leaving nothing but a white space in a child's understanding of family. Ethan took the page with careful hands, as if it were more valuable than any contract he had ever signed. "I would like to earn that spot," he said, not to Noah alone, but to Amara as well. Amara stood beneath the summit lights, posture straight, expression calm. The same woman who had walked out of his gala years ago carrying silence like armor. She looked at the drawing, then at Ethan kneeling before their son, and for the first time there was something in her eyes beyond resolve. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But acknowledgement. The beginning of earned accountability. Around them, the summit had become background noise. Claire had disappeared behind a wall of legal advisors and cameras. The board was already in emergency conversations about reputational damage and leadership review. But none of that touched the center of the room now. This was no longer about public image. It was about a child asking the simplest question in the world and a man finally choosing not to lie. Noah stepped 1 inch closer, studying Ethan's face with open curiosity. "Do you like dinosaurs?" he asked. The question startled a laugh out of Ethan, soft and broken in the best possible way. "I do," he admitted. Noah smiled, the same crooked smile Ethan had worn in college photos and shareholder magazines for years. "Good," the boy said, "because I have the big T-Rex book at home." Ethan looked up at Amara, the drawing still in his hand, and understood the boundary without her saying it. Access would not be bought with apologies or headlines. It would be earned in ordinary moments. Storybooks, school pickups, trust rebuilt inch by inch. Amara's voice finally entered the silence, low and unwavering. "A father is not a title, Ethan. It is a pattern." He nodded slowly, humbled in a way no public disgrace could have achieved. "Then I will start with the next right step." And as Noah reached for his hand with the innocent confidence of a child willing to let truth become possibility, the most powerful man in the room realized redemption would not begin in a boardroom, but in the blank white space of a little boy's drawing. The summit ended in headlines, but the real beginning came 3 days later in Brooklyn, where the truth had to survive without cameras. Late afternoon sunlight poured through the tall brownstone windows, warming the hardwood floors and strips of gold as Noah sat cross-legged on the living room rug with his oversized dinosaur book spread open across his lap. The great green Tyrannosaurus illustration covered nearly the entire page, and his small finger traced the sharp teeth with serious fascination. Across from him, Ethan sat on the floor in rolled shirt sleeves and a plain navy sweater, stripped of the executive armor that had once made him seem untouchable. There were no podiums here, no board members, no publicists whispering optics into his ear. Just a father, a child, and the ordinary silence of a home built on truth instead of performance. "That one is my favorite," Noah said, pushing the book slightly toward him. Ethan smiled, the expression softer now, unfamiliar in its sincerity. "Mine too," he admitted. "He looks fierce, but really he was probably just protecting what mattered." The words lingered in the room longer than either of them expected. From the kitchen doorway, Amara watched without interrupting, a mug of tea warming her hands. She had agreed to this first visit under conditions so clear they left no room for misunderstanding. 2 hours, in her home, no staff, no lawyers, no press, no promises bigger than the moment itself. Ethan had accepted every boundary without argument, and somehow that mattered more than any apology he had tried to form at the summit. Noah turned another page and leaned naturally against Ethan's arm, as if children always know when honesty has entered a room. Ethan glanced up toward Amara, his voice low enough to keep the moment intimate. "Thank you for this." Amara crossed into the room with the same measured grace that had carried her through every public reckoning. But this time, there was no stage beneath her feet, only the quiet strength of the life she had protected. "Do not thank me yet," she said evenly. "This is not trust. This is access." Ethan nodded once, taking the distinction exactly as she intended. "Then I will earn the rest." Her gaze held his for a long moment, calm and unwavering. "That is where men like you usually fail. You think intention is the same as consistency." Noah looked up between them, unaware of the full gravity of the conversation, but sensing its seriousness. Ethan gently closed the dinosaur book and turned toward his son fully. "Then I start with consistency," he said, more to the child than anyone else. Tomorrow I will come to your school play, if your mom says that is all right. Noah's eyes widened. I am a tree, he announced proudly. The image nearly pulled a laugh from Amara despite herself. Ethan smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. Then I would not miss the most important tree in Brooklyn. The simplicity of the promise changed something. Subtle in the room. Not resolution, not forgiveness, but a new rhythm beginning to form. Later, as evening settled over the brownstone and the city outside softened into headlights and distant sirens, Noah had fallen asleep on the couch with the dinosaur book still open against his chest. Ethan stood near the window, hands in his pockets, looking out at the quiet residential street instead of the skyline towers where he once measured his worth. The board offered me a path out, he said quietly. Step down for 6 months, issue a statement, rebuild the image. Amara remained by the fireplace, arms folded, her posture still the axis of the room. And what did you say? Ethan turned toward her, no longer hiding behind polished phrases. I said my image is the least interesting thing about this story. The answer landed with more weight than any rehearsed apology ever could. Amara studied him, searching not for remorse but for alignment between words and action. Good, she said finally. Because Noah is not a press strategy. He is a child. If you come into his life, it will be on school mornings, forgotten lunchboxes, fevers at midnight, parent-teacher conferences, and every ordinary Tuesday when there is nothing to gain. Ethan exhaled slowly, as if the scale of real fatherhood had finally become visible. That is exactly what I want. She stepped closer then, stopping just far enough away to keep the boundary visible. No, she corrected him softly. That is what you say you want. The difference will be what you do 6 months from now when this is no longer trending. The words were not cruel. They were the purest form of dignity, truth without spectacle. Ethan accepted them with the humility of a man who finally understood that redemption is measured in repetition, not emotion. He glanced toward the sleeping boy on the couch, the dinosaur book rising and falling with each small breath. Then judge me there, he said. Amara followed his gaze to Noah, and for the first time since the summit, the room held something almost peaceful. I already am, she replied. Outside, the Brooklyn streetlights flickered on one by one, casting warm amber across the windows. Inside, the future remained unwritten, but for once the blank space no longer felt like loss. It felt like structure. A father learning that presence is a practice, a mother refusing to confuse access with trust, and a child asleep between them, turning dignity into the only foundation strong enough to hold what came next. 6 months later, the spring air over Brooklyn carried the scent of fresh rain and flowering trees as parents filled the small elementary school auditorium with paper programs, phone cameras, and the warm chaos only children can create. The stage was decorated with painted cardboard forests, bright green paper leaves, and hand-drawn birds taped slightly crooked against a blue backdrop. In the second row, Amara sat with her posture as composed as ever, a soft cream coat folded neatly over her lap, her eyes fixed on the curtain where Noah would appear any second in his carefully crafted tree costume. Beside her, Ethan adjusted the tiny camcorder in his hands for the third time, not because he needed to, but because nervous joy had made him almost boyish in a way Amara had never seen during their marriage. Over the past 6 months, he had not missed a single Tuesday pickup, a single parent conference, a single bedtime call when travel for the restructured nonprofit arm of Whitmore Global briefly took him out of state. He had shown up with forgotten lunches, attended Saturday soccer drills in the rain, learned how Noah liked his grilled cheese cut into triangles, and somehow memorized the names of every dinosaur in the oversized book that still lived on the brownstone coffee table. Redemption had not arrived in speeches. It had arrived in repetition. The auditorium lights dimmed, and the room softened into excited whispers. The curtain parted. A line of tiny children stepped onto the stage in costumes of foxes, birds, clouds, and trees. Then Noah appeared in the center, standing perfectly still in a green foam trunk with felt branches stretching from his shoulders, his gray eyes scanning the audience until they landed on the two faces he now expected to find together. His smile lit instantly. Ethan's breath caught. He lowered the camcorder for 1 second, forgetting the recording entirely as the weight of the moment settled into something deeper than pride. Noah no longer carried a blank space in his family drawing. He carried certainty. The school play itself was simple and charming, a spring pageant about seasons changing and how forests grow stronger when every part works together. Yet every line Noah delivered felt almost symbolic. Strong roots need truth, sunlight, and time. He said clearly from center stage, his little voice carrying through the auditorium microphone. A few parents smiled at the sweetness of the line, but Amara felt Ethan go still beside her. The sentence was no longer just part of a child's script. It was the architecture of everything they had become. When the applause finally filled the room and the children rushed off stage in delighted chaos, Noah ran straight toward them in his oversized tree costume, nearly tripping over the foam roots around his ankles. Ethan met him halfway, crouching just in time to steady him. "You were incredible," he said, laughter and emotion blending in his voice. Noah beamed, cheeks flushed with excitement. "Did I sound like a real tree?" Ethan smiled. "The best one in New York." Amara stood a few feet away watching the exchange, and for the first time there was no caution in her chest, only clarity. Ethan had done exactly what she said men like him rarely do. He had made consistency louder than apology. As the auditorium slowly emptied, the principal approached them holding a framed child art piece from the classroom hallway exhibit. "Noah wanted both of you to have this," she said warmly. It was the same family drawing from months ago, but no longer unfinished. The brownstones still stood in brown crayon, Amara's curls still framed in dark loops. Noah still wore his bright blue sweater, but now the once empty figure beside them was filled in carefully with gray eyes, a navy jacket, and one oversized hand holding Noah's. Above the picture, in uneven kindergarten lettering, Noah had written, "My family grew roots." Ethan stared at the drawing longer than any earnings report, merger contract, or media profile had ever held his attention. His voice, when it came, was quiet with the kind of gratitude that no longer needed performance. He finished it. Amara looked at the page, then at the man standing beside her son, and finally allowed herself the smallest, truest smile. "No," she said softly, her voice carrying the same dignity that had once walked out beneath Manhattan chandeliers. He did not finish it. He proved it. Outside, the evening sun broke through the rain clouds, casting gold across the school steps as families spilled into the parking lot. Noah walked between them, one hand in Amara's and one in Ethan's, his tree costume rustling with every proud little step. The city moved around them in ordinary sounds. Car doors closing, children laughing, sneakers on wet pavement. No cameras, no headlines, no summit lights, just the quiet evidence of what truth, time, and earned presence can build. Ethan looked down at Noah, then up at Amara, and in the golden light of an ordinary Brooklyn evening, he finally understood the shape of real legacy. It was never the company towers with his name etched in glass. It was this small hand in his, this woman beside him whose dignity had rewritten the meaning of strength, and the child between them who had turned truth into roots deep enough to outlast every lie. Together they walked toward the car beneath a sky clearing into blue, and for the first time the future did not feel like optics. It felt like home.